Hi, I'm Lisa Marie Smith. I'm a librarian at the Vernon Area Public Library, and I'm author of the Arcadia publishing book, Lincolnshire. Welcome to the Vernon Township Cemetery, established 1851. In the early 1800s, Vernon Township and all of Lake County were unsettled. The only permanent residents were the local Potawatomi tribes. The land looked vastly different than it does today, not just because the buildings were gone, but because it was prairie. It was not forested. And that's because the prairie fires would race eastward, taking down all of the trees in its path, only stopping at the Des Plaines River. In fact, westward is much newer growth than the trees on the east side of the Des Plaines. I'm here today to take you on a short tour and to tell you some of the stories of the earliest settlers here in Vernon Township. This impressive monument belongs to Captain Daniel Wright. Daniel Wright was born in Rutland, Vermont in 1778, shortly after the American Revolution. He fought, like so many others, in the War of 1812, and afterward he received a land grant from the United States government. A land grant is a piece of property that was given to a soldier as a payment for their involvement in the war. Wright took his family from Vermont out to Columbus, Ohio, where he lived until he decided that apparently it was either getting too crowded for him or he wanted to explore further. So being a hardy soul, he set out toward the west. He went to Chicago, which was Fort Dearborn at that point, and headed north. Now at that time, the Potawatomi had settled and were living in this particular area around Lincolnshire and all of northern Illinois. They had signed a treaty with the United States government called the Treaty of Chicago, and were going to be vacating the land here in northern Illinois, heading north, making the way for settlers from out east to move further west. Well, Captain Wright came north from Fort Dearborn looking for a piece of property. He came up as far as what is now known as Ryerson Woods and decided that that was going to be the place that he was going to build a new home. He met and befriended the local Potawatomi tribe that were stationed here. They had an encampment that spread most of the way from Half Day, which is the corner of 22 and Milwaukee Avenue, down toward Aptekissick Road. Now, Aptekissick Road is named Aptekissick Road because of the Potawatomi chief of that tribe. He was also called Hafta, a nickname that is purported to mean he could do a whole day's work in just a half a day. Well, Wright befriended the local Potawatomis. But this is in 1833. The Treaty of Chicago did not go into effect until 1835. So in fact, he came a little earlier than he was supposed to when he came looking for land in this new area. It was only because of the help of these Potawatomi that he survived that very harsh first winter. They helped him making his enclosure, a 20 by 20 cabin, and actually helped him get food and provided some food so he could survive that first winter. Well, afterward, settlers were starting to come into the region just like Daniel Wright, and it was starting to become more populated, settling from here in Half Day up to Libertyville and beyond. Wright called for his family, who were still living in Ohio, to come and join him. The family, his wife, Ruth, and his children made that arduous journey. They went over prairie, through streams, through rivers, had a very, very tough time making that journey, but eventually did arrive here to no doubt what was going to be a joyous reunion. But that reunion was to be joyous for just a very short time. One day after the family arrived, their son Daniel died, supposedly getting sick along the way because it was such a tough journey. 3 days after that, only 3 days, his wife, Ruth, then died as well. So Daniel Wright had his family here, but he had lost the near and dear ones to his heart. He survived and raised his family for several years as this area became more populated. He met and remarried a woman who was a settler here and lived out the rest of his days in this area. Now, Daniel Wright was an especially hardy man. He came out at age 56. Now, 56 was already at the point where many, many settlers actually passed away. People weren't nearly as long-lived as they were now. But Captain Wright, a hardy man and a survivor, lived past his 56 years until age 95 when he passed away. He's buried here, and on this monument bears his name and a portion of his story that's still visible. Some of it is readable, some of it is not, but it talks about his journey out from Rutland, Vermont. On one side is his wife named Ruth, and the other side is Rachel, his second wife. On the back, the names of his children. Directly to your right is the monument for his daughter Caroline. Caroline came along to this new place with her family. Daniel Wright was the first settler. You could consider him the father of Lake County, the founder of our county and this entire area of Vernon Township. His daughter met and married another settler. Theirs was the very first marriage ceremony held in Lake County. She lived the rest of her days out here. Now her son, William Wigham, is pictured in a very famous photograph next to a boulder inscribed with the name of Daniel Wright. This boulder was placed initially on the corner of Aptekissick Road and Milwaukee Avenue, commemorating the arrival of Daniel Wright. But it became such a popular attraction that people were pulling off the road to see it. It became a danger. So that monument was picked up and moved to Ryerson Woods, much closer to the site of his actual cabin. A couple of interesting facts about Daniel Wright. Daniel Wright was related to the Wright brothers, also of Ohio, the famous aviation pioneers. He was also related to Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner, the publisher from Chicago, is his great-great-great-grandson. And as my research has shown, very fitting, Daniel Wright's 14 times great-grandfather was from Lincolnshire, England. So truly, the family came full circle with his arrival here. We're just steps away from the Daniel Wright Monument here by John Easton. John Easton was another early settler to the Vernon Township area, arriving in 1837 from Putnam, New York. He served as the area's first male school teacher for only a year before he opened a general store at his home in Barn. That was located on the property that is now known as Strawberry Fields Pancake House. Now, John Easton kept meticulous records in his ledger book. He recorded all of the names of the area residents who came and purchased materials and goods from him. He recorded their names, the type of materials or goods that they purchased, the cost, and whether or not they purchased on cash or credit. He eventually retired in 1870 and moved, sold his home to other buyers. Now those buyers found that ledger book of his tucked in one of the areas of the barn. And being frugal as people were in those days, they actually repurposed that ledger book as a scrapbook, taking the pages of that ledger book and pasting things on them. Well, years later, that ledger was discovered underneath those scrapbook pages. Some of those pages have been removed and restored to see those original purchases. That ledger is often the primary source and the only source of some of the area's earliest residents. It's an interesting look into the past, the types of food people would purchase, the type of goods, even materials that they would make into clothing for their families. That scrapbook and ledger survives to this day. It's housed in the Lake County Archives, but luckily for us, the Lake County Archives has digitized those pages, and it can be seen online through your computer anytime that you'd like. It's an interesting look into this area of how these hardy people survived, and is a wonderful resource to not only children learning about the area, but to genealogists studying their families, and a glimpse into the past. Standing next to this impressive looking monument that belongs to Job W. Tripp, another early resident here in Vernon Township. He came here from Westport, Massachusetts prior to 1840. Now 1840 is a very important date in Lake County history. It's when the entire county was surveyed and broken up into parcels for purchase. Job Tripp, along with everyone else in the county, made the trek to Chicago to purchase their land for $1.25 an acre. Job met and married Mary Cassidy here in Lake County, and together had 11 children. Now, families that size weren't unusual, so it's very understandable when families of that size came into the county or grew in this county as residents arrived. They needed larger schools and more numerous schools. The original school here in Half Day could not accommodate the number of children in the area. So the local government started searching for plats for new school buildings. Job Tripp sold a corner of his property to the local government for a new school. Now, schools were often named for the locations where they were at or the people whose land they were on. And that is how Tripp School began. Tripp School was on Job's property just south of the present Half Day. As the area grew, so did the number of schools. And those schools were nothing like the schools of today. They were one-room schoolhouses. The school on Job's property had benches for all the children to sit together in the same classroom. Everyone, the smallest child to the largest child, were taught by one teacher, with younger children sitting on benches and older children sitting on benches and being very fortunate to have tables to write on. Those schools, like all the other buildings here, didn't have central heat. They were heated by one potbelly stove in the corner of the room. And it's told that children would bring their lunches to school and set them outside. In those days when the winter was so cold, those lunches would freeze. And at noontime, those lunches were brought inside in the pails and put near the fire to warm up and thaw out for the kids to eat their lunches. Now, the schools were reorganized later on in Lake County, and Appikissick School was combined with Tripp School into our present Appikissick Tripp Consolidated District. That original schoolhouse that held Tripp School, well, that still exists, but it was moved from its original site down to the antique sales barn area near the intersection of Milwaukee Avenue in Inverary, where you can still see that building today. It's used to house retail. But if you want to get an idea, a real feeling of what school was like with all of those kids in the building, take a trip down there one day and imagine what it would be like with everyone, 1st through 8th grade, together in one location. And what a task it must have been for those school teachers. All headstones tell just a portion of the story, and this is just a very small portion of Edward's story. Edward Shapter came to America from England with his family. They settled here in Vernon Township, just north of this point at what's now Half Day Preserve. Edward was so moved by the goings on during the Civil War that he enlisted in the fight on the side of the North. Now, Edward was used to being around horses, and Edward's ability that he came to the military with provided him the basis of the skills that he needed to use during the Civil War. He quickly rose through the ranks because of his leadership and skill to the rank of sergeant. No pictures have been found of Edward Shapter as a sergeant, but there are photos and drawings of people wearing the type of military uniform that the cavalry sergeants would have worn. He was put in the cavalry and put together with other people who understood and appreciated and could handle horses in Company I, all composed of Lake County men. Now, Company I gathered together and mustered out of St. Charles, Illinois, down toward Jefferson Barracks, which is just across the river from Alton, Illinois, in Missouri. At Jefferson Barracks, he was trained along with the others and sent initially to guard the prisoners in the holdings at the jail in Alton, Illinois. He was then reassigned to Jefferson Barracks across the river, a large military installation. Now, Company I did see action, but it wasn't action like you would see down in the South. He and the rest of his company fought guerrilla war style. That means not fighting in straight lines like we imagine the Redcoats did during the Revolutionary War, but through the woods, along the mountains, along the ridges, fighting incursions nearly every day with the rebel soldiers around the state of Missouri. Company I was renowned for one thing, their quickness. They actually at one point moved 33 miles in one day, chasing after a group of enemy soldiers. After the war, Edward came back here to Vernon Township and continued to farm. He's laid to rest here in Vernon Township Cemetery with other brave men who fought during that war, along with the other veterans here of our American conflicts and wars. I'm standing next to Jabez Sprague's headstone. Jabez Sprague came to the Vernon Township area with his family, his parents, his 3 sisters, in 1836. And in 1840, the family purchased land. But like so many, they actually purchased land that was not adjacent to one another. The Sprague family purchased a land to farm in Prairie View, just down Route 22. But they also had a piece of property near the river. Many families did that because they needed fuel for their fires and wood for their dwellings. So woodlots, as they were called, were sold next to the river. Now, these woodlots had no way to get there other than going through other people's property. But everyone in the area had them and used them for the same purpose. Now, the Sprague's farm in Prairie View was the family farm. But soon after they arrived, Jabez's father became an invalid, and he was left to farm by himself, sod busting that virgin territory on his own without any help. He created a farm that the family lived on for years, and at one point decided that after things were being parceled up in Lake County, that it would be a prudent move for the family if he were to divide up that property and sell individual lots. So from the Sprague farm in Prairie View, one of the very first subdivisions in Lake County was formed. Now, you might remember the name Sprague from a local area landmark here, the Laura B. Sprague School on Riverwoods Road. Laura B. Sprague is Jabez's sister and was the first teacher in Lake County, having held classes in the Sprague home. She only taught for a year when she married, and as custom was not allowing it at the time, had to leave her position. She could not continue working as a married woman. She's actually not buried here in the Vernon Cemetery. There is a Laura Sprague here, right beside Jabez's stone, and that's his daughter, Laura E. Sprague, who is commonly confused for her aunt, Laura B. Laura B. is actually buried in Rose Hill Cemetery with no clue of her maiden name. She married a man named Edward Simmons and is buried next to him with her married name, Laura Simmons, on the headstone. Now, Jabez's farm being in Prairie View actually became the site of another town that grew out of transportation needs. Half Day grew out of Milwaukee Avenue, the road that led from Chicago to Milwaukee. As the trains came into the area in 1886, the train line went to a spot just west of the Half Day area. From that train line, a town grew up around it, and that was called Prairie View. Now, Prairie View became a big town. It was much larger than Half Day. Half Day had stores, hotels, blacksmiths, doctors, but Prairie View was much larger because of that mode of transportation. It had hotels, it had a confectionery, it had several stores, blacksmiths, doctors, it had a lumber yard, it had a mill. Until one fateful night in July of 1920. It was a hot, windy night, and a fire began. A fire that is said to be started in the sawdust of the ice house of Fred Priest's Tavern, which is now the Prairie House restaurant. That fire started and that wind blew it around. Not unlike the Chicago fire years earlier, the wind and the conditions contributed to the veracity of the fire. Well, that fire leapt from wooden building to wooden building. It soon engulfed the town of Prairie View. The train station there was on fire. Word was sent to the train line. They actually sent an engine down with a water car to help keep that fire at bay. But that fire was out of control. That fire leapt from building to building, engulfing the lumber yard and all the fuel there. And next to the lumber yard was a giant store of coal, very flammable material. That fire got in that 200 tons of coal, and nothing was going to stop it. The water that the train line sent down saved some of the train line's property, but the fire got so hot and burned the stock pens next to it. Animals' lives were lost. It was so hot it actually melted the rails that the trains rode upon themselves. Well, countless buildings were destroyed. Families lost possessions. Businesses lost everything. The insurance agency that is in the old-looking building in Prairie View to this day is an original general store. They say that that general store survived only because their well was a little bit deeper than everyone else's. There was no fire department in the area, and only a volunteer force that could only pitifully try to put out that blaze. It burned for days and could be seen for miles and miles. Unfortunately, most of the businesses did not have insurance that covered the fire, so their losses were total. Very few people had business insurance. In fact, only 2 or 3 came back after that fire. We have to wonder what this entire area would be like had that fire been brought under control or not occurred at all. It could have changed the entire trajectory of Lake County, and certainly the trajectory of this area. But that is something that we'll never know. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed learning a few of the stories of the early pioneers of Lake County. And I hope that it sparked an interest in you to learn more about the rich history of this area that we call home. If you're interested in learning more about local history, be sure to check out the Vernon Area Public Library. Thank you.